Hello, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Implementation and Action, Making a Good Faith Effort to Comply with the Violence Against Women Act Amendments to the Clery Act. This webinar is one of a series of free webinars during National Campus Safety Awareness Month. My name is Abigail Boyer, Assistant Executive Director of Programs for the Clery Center for Security on Campus. Myself and our Program Manager, Amy Guthrie, will moderate today's webinar. She is going to start out by reviewing a few housekeeping items before we get started.
Thank you, Abby. Thanks for joining us, everyone. We encourage you to interact with us throughout the webinar by typing in questions and comments using the questions pane. We will also use the questions pane to communicate with you any links to resources or information that are mentioned throughout the webinar. There will also be, we'll also be conducting a short survey at the end of the webinar, and we would very much like to hear from you, your feedback on what we can do to continue to improve and provide you with the best possible information and resources. And also, we will be recording the session today, so you will receive a link to the recording within 48 hours. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. Before we dive into webinar content, I just want to do a quick overview of what today's webinar will cover. As you know, all colleges and universities that receive Title IV federal funding must comply with the Clery Act, which requires colleges and universities to disclose specific crimes that occur within and around their campus community, as well as have certain crime, safety, and security policies and procedures. As part of these requirements, institutions must put together an annual security report that includes policy statements, or what our organization often refers to as the Cliff Notes of an institution's policies, as well as crime statistics. Most recently, the 2013 Violence Against Women Reauthorization Act amended the Clery Act to afford specific rights and options to survivors of sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking. As the Department of Education clarified in a recent Dear Colleague letter, the statutory changes will require changes to the regulations for Clery. And earlier this year, the department brought together a committee of representatives who would be impacted by these changes, particularly college and university practitioners. These representatives came to a consensus on draft regulations, and one of today's panelists, Michael Webster, was an alternate negotiator on this committee, as was our Executive Director, Allison Kiss. Final regulations are expected this November. However, in the meantime, colleges and universities are expected to make a good faith effort to comply with the statutory provisions as written, which should be reflected in this year's Annual Security Report, or ASR. We were thrilled to have Margolis Healy and the National Center for Campus Public Safety offer to host a webinar to have a candid discussion about what colleges and universities are doing to make that good faith effort to comply with the changes. As our in-person training and past webinar participants have often said that they really appreciate hearing how other institutions have applied some of these changes in practice. Please note that the conversation is not meant to be prescriptive, but instead give you a sense of what others are doing. Because we're going to focus on application, the webinar will not go into the technical elements of the changes one by one. However, we do have some past recorded webinars that are available for free that do cover these elements, and you'll be able to find those on the policy page on our website that's focused on the VAWA amendments to Clery. Instead, today we'll focus on identifying strategies that institutions can use to address the VAWA amendments and improve their overall compliance with Clery. We'll have a conversation about what's being done at institutions nationwide, and we are going to leave time at the end of the webinar for questions and answers. Please feel free to use the questions pane, as Amy mentioned, to share your questions and comments throughout, and we'll get to as many as possible through that last 15 minutes. We're also so happy that today's panelists were able to take the time out of their extremely busy schedules to join us for the next hour. So I just want to share a little bit about our panelists before we get started. Stephen Healy is a managing partner and co-founder of Margolis Healy and is a nationally recognized expert on campus public safety and the Clery Act. From 2003 through 2009, he was the Director of Public Safety at Princeton University, where he led the university's safety, security, and law enforcement programs and is credited with enhancing and expanding the department's overall professionalism and capabilities. A past president of the International Association of Campus Law Enforcement Administrators, or IACLEA, Mr. Healy served as a member of the association's Government Relations Committee for 13 years. As president of IACLEA, Mr. Healy contributed significantly to the national dialogue about campus safety and security in the aftermath of the tragic rampage shooting at Virginia Tech University in April 2007. And I apologize as my screen pops up there. Mr. Healy serves as a subject matter expert for the U.S. Departments of Education and Justice, and he testified before the U.S. Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs on the topic of security on America's campuses, and testified before the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Education and Labor on the topic of best practices for keeping America's campuses safe. Mr. Healy served as chairperson of the National Center for Campus Public Safety Advisory Board and was responsible for leading the development of a strategic plan and framework for the National Center for Campus Public Safety. He's currently the chair of the advisory board for the National Center, which was funded by Congress with bipartisan support in 2013. Michael Webster has been in his present position as the Director of Campus Safety at McDaniel College, founded as Western Maryland College, located in suburban Baltimore since 1991. Prior to that, Mike worked as the Assistant Director of Public Safety at Emerson College and as the Operations Manager, Campus Police Sergeant at Wentworth Institute of Technology, both of which are in Boston, Massachusetts. Each of these agencies was a broadly missioned public safety agency with multiple roles, including uniformed sworn law enforcement and non-sworn security, emergency medical services, fire prevention, community education, crime prevention, and physical security technology, to name a few. For many years, he served as the Government Relations Chair for the International Association of Campus Law Enforcement Administrators, and in this role, Mike has participated in all 3 negotiated rulemaking sessions with the United States Department of Education for the Clery Act, the most recent being the VAWA amendments of 2013. Mike also served as a content reviewer for both versions of the Handbook for Campus Safety and Security Reporting published by the U.S. Department of Ed to facilitate compliance with the Clery Act. And then Pamela Heatley, last but not least, is the Senior Associate Director and Deputy Title IX Coordinator of the University of Michigan's Office for Institutional Equity. In that role, she creates and implements programming and services for faculty, staff, and students in the area of discrimination and harassment, inclusiveness, diversity, and cultural understanding. Pam has worked in higher education for 25 years. Prior to joining the University of Michigan, she practiced law in-house at public institutions, including the Michigan State University and the University of Vermont. Her legal practice has been wide-ranging with a particular emphasis on discrimination and harassment, employment law, and student-related legal issues. In addition to her work at the University of Michigan, Pam is a part-time lecturer at Eastern Michigan University, where she teaches legal issues in higher education. Pam received her BA with highest distinction from Wayne State University and her JD from the University of Michigan Law School. And can you imagine, I even shortened those bios, but they've done quite a bit of work. So thank you all for joining us, and we'll get started. As I mentioned, the Department of Education has asked colleges and universities to make a good faith effort to comply with the statutory changes within the VAWA amendments to the Clery Act. What are some of the approaches that you've seen institutions take in addressing this issue? So, Mike, let's start with you. What are some of the strategies that you've been seeing? And I think we might be having some technical difficulties with Mike. So maybe we'll redirect to Pam as Mike unmutes himself. And I know that Pam, in past conversations, you've mentioned that a lot of institutions have really recently needed to change their approach in how to revise their policies and procedures and really who's at the table. So do you mind speaking to that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I think before the VAWA amendments to Clery, many institutions, probably most institutions, Clery was really seen as something that was handled by the police department or Department of Public Safety or whichever unit on campus was handling the institution's safety and security concerns. Now, and they would produce the annual security report. That approach, I think most institutions who have made themselves familiar with the VAWA amendments realize that that approach isn't probably going to be successful into the future because the amendments are such that it really hits the institution in a much broader way. And so many more people need to be brought around the table. I think one of the challenges that institutions face in that regard is who takes ownership of that? Who brings people around the table? And what people should be around the table. And I have one suggestion that may or may not be popular amongst our listeners, But I actually think the Office of the General Counsel is usually a good office to make that happen. And my reasoning for that is that, it could be the Police Department or Department of Public Safety, but the Office of the General Counsel is very used to taking a role in bringing people from across campus to one spot to discuss an issue. So from that perspective, they're a natural leader. I don't think that that necessarily means that they truly have to lead the entire effort or approve everything that happens within that effort, but they tend to be a unit that can make that happen. Whereas if you have a unit like the police department, it may be that they can get everybody around the table, or it may be that there are some units whose attention they just can't grab. So OGC, I think, tends to work. I think at some institutions this isn't going to the OGC, and it's either remaining within whoever's handling campus safety and security, or it's being segued over to the Title IX coordinator. Again, on an individual campus, that may be a successful effort. But again, one of the challenges might be whether the Title IX coordinator can get the right people around the table. And also, I think one of the risks of having the Title IX coordinator take the lead on that is that there's a chance that people around the table might commingle the VAWA amendments and Title IX issues. And even the recent guidance we got about the good faith effort cautions institutions that this is not Title IX and Title IX is not this. And so I think having the OGC as sort of the leader of this effort makes sure that people keep that in mind. Having said that, there's a lot of synergy between Title IX and VAWA that can be acted upon by the institution, but sometimes having the Title IX coordinator as the leader of that effort can cause people to become too comfortable that if we're compliant with Title IX, we're also compliant with the VAWA amendments to Clery. And then just as a to finish up that thought, in terms of the people that you should have around the table, I think you definitely want whoever's handling your safety and security there. You do want your Title IX coordinator there. You want someone from the Office of the General Counsel. You definitely would want someone from Student Life. But I also think that you need to think about new partners who should be there. And one of the really important partners who should be there that I think is important for institutions to focus on is human resources. Because one of the changes, if you look at the statutory changes, you'll see in many spots where it used to say student, it now will either say victim or student or employee. So the Department of Education is making it very clear to us, or the Congress is making it very clear to us that these efforts that they want undertaken aren't particular to students any longer. So you need to make sure you're representing students, faculty, and staff on your campus. So HR, academic HR, and other partners should be there and should be part of this effort.
Great, and I think that's a really good point to make about the fact that Clery and Title IX do intersect, but there are some distinctions. I think historically some of the things that we've been seeing as an organization is there are institutions that say, oh, we've got Title IX, we do that really, really well, but here's Clery over here in the corner, or vice versa. And the reality is that there are multiple federal laws and institutions have to be in compliance with all. So I think that that's a really useful concept to make sure that all of those different individuals are at the table. And before we kind of get feedback from other folks, do you have any recommendations or ideas as to how to start that conversation if historically the institution really haven't connected in that way before?
So I think getting everybody around the table and making sure they know one another, first of all. But I think maybe beginning to take an inventory of what do we already do to address these issues. What do we have in place? And using that as a jumping off point for how to move forward, because you don't necessarily have to reinvent things. An institution might be pleasantly surprised that it has more in place than it thinks it does, but then how to build on that to make sure you're meeting the VAWA amendments, Title IX, and of course Title VII and other obligations that you might have in place.
Great.
So again, having that.
Webster, on to that? Abby, it's Mike Webster. Could I add on to that?
Oh, absolutely. Please do.
I think I should, in the interest of full disclosure, I should probably mention I also am a senior associate with Margolis and Healy. So some of the things that I'm going to say have been gathered from not necessarily McDaniel College, but rather clients, institutional clients of MHA. And this is one of those points that I want to make. it is not uncommon at all for us to recommend to clients the establishment of a Clery Compliance Committee, ideally with a presidential or a presidential cabinet level charge that cuts across the silos of an institution that can sometimes negatively impact the institution's ability to comply fully or to comply substantially and deeply with the Clery Act and or Title IX. I think that everything that Pam said was spot on, but with my experience with MH&A, I would color that in a little bit and say that it adds some weight rather than the historical starting point for Clery compliance, the University Police or University Public Safety Department. If this comes from the highest levels of the institution, achieving the cooperation that's needed can sometimes be moved along a bit more quickly.
Great. And I think, you know, even going back to what you were saying, Pam, I really like this idea or that concept that you kind of presented of really starting from your strengths, because I think what we're hearing a lot is a lot of institutions making decisions or moving forward based out of fear around compliance and not starting from the framework of what are we already doing, who do we already have at our table that might have some value or some expertise to really add to this discussion. And I think, Mike, absolutely, so making sure that you're really kind of incorporating all of those different elements. What has been some of the strategies, Mike, you mentioned your experience with MHA as well as on your campus. What have been some of the experiences that you've seen as the starting point for addressing the VAWA amendments, or how have you approached that?
Great, thanks. Yeah, so I think the important thing to remember is at this point, in the absence of a published regulation by the Department of Education, the standard that you're going to be held to is a good faith attempt to comply. So that leads to a question, well, what does good faith mean? And that sort of is in common usage. But what I have done is I have tried to use the draft regulation as a definition of good faith, and with the expectation that the draft regulation in large part probably will not be changed substantially at the time it's published as a final regulation. So my idea by using the draft regulation was I would already be that much further along when it is published.
Yeah, and I think that that's something that we're seeing quite a bit. We should, you know, emphasize and make it clear that the Department of Education has asked institutions to comply with the statutory language. But what, Mike, what you're saying is on point with what we're seeing at many institutions, which is they're certainly starting with the base elements of the statutory language and making sure that they're making a good faith effort with those, but they're using the draft regulations to really kind of inform if there are areas where they feel as though they need more information and more feedback, as we might see in the final regulations, or using the draft regulations as a starting point for that. Although the Department of Ed has said that it could potentially change based on the feedback from that public comment period, but absolutely using the draft regulations, taking a look at the draft regulations to really give a perspective as to what you might expect from the final regulations. Stephen, do you have anything to add to that? Is there an area of the VAWA amendments that you think that institutions should take an even closer look at?
Sure, thanks, Abby. I think probably one of the most visible signs or visible parts of the VAWA amendments is the written notice of rights and resources. We know in law enforcement that has been viewed as a best practice for many, many years. So when a complainant comes forward, you know, you make sure that you provide some written notice to the individual, because at the time that they're reporting, you know, if you're just having a conversation with them, you don't really know what parts of that conversation they're going to remember. So it's really important to have a written notice, and that's one of the key fundamental requirements. So what we've seen is that in many cases, a lot of different offices are providing complainants, survivors, with a lot of information, but the information is different. And so the VAWA amendments require the institution to provide this written notice of what the person's rights are and what the resources are that the institution offers. And so it's really important. And back to both Pam and Mike's point about having that committee, that's one of the fundamental responsibilities of this committee, making sure that it is able to take inventory of all the resources that are available both on and off campus, and also make sure that all the rights are clearly spelled out. And I know a number of institutions are in the process of revising their policies, especially around sexual harassment, sexual assault. But this is an opportunity to make sure that that all of those rights that are outlined in the policy are also in this written notice, so that the complainant and the respondent both have a complete list of what their rights are. They know who to talk to if they have questions about their rights, and then they know about all of the different resources that are available to them both on and off campus. So I really think that the written notice is key, and we've been telling institutions that we have the honor to work with for a while now that you really need to have this done, because the law is in effect, right? And the department expects us to make a good faith effort, and so if you have this this written notice, at least that shows that the institution has thought deeply about what those rights are, what their policies and procedures are, and then again about the resources that are available to both complainants and respondents.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point, because it really causes the institutions to kind of revisit with their own processes. I know that Pam has mentioned quite a bit in whether it's crafting policies or whether it's writing a written notice, such as you're talking about, the importance of really being able to not only know what your own process and procedure is, but to be able to communicate that in a way that your audiences will understand. And that may be something that Pam might choose to explore later on in the webinar, because I think it's certainly relevant to what we're seeing. I also want to go a little bit more broadly, because we know that even outside of these recent changes that there can be some challenges to Clery compliance. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about what are some of the compliance challenges that you're seeing, whether in relation to the VAWA amendments or overall, and some key solutions that institutions can explore as they evaluate their own compliance. So Steve, I'm going to go back to you for a moment. Can you identify a key challenge and some things that institutions might implement to address the challenge? And I know that I also want to mention that some folks were having some difficulty hearing the presenters, so you may need to move a little bit more closely to your phone or your audio.
Okay, well, hopefully that wasn't me. If I move any closer, the phone will be in my mouth. So, one of you gotta have a little levity here. So one of the I think one of the most significant challenges that we're seeing, and this is with institutions who are both being proactive around reviewing their compliance program, but also some institutions that may be under review by the Department of Education Clery Compliance Division, is the audit trail. And let me tell you what I mean by audit trail. And if you haven't been under a program review, then that term is probably foreign to you. So basically, what we're talking about with an audit trail is, can you produce records, documents, emails, reports, whatever they are, for every statistic that's in your ASR. So this is important. It was important before the VAWA amendments, but clearly it will become more important with the VAWA amendments, because we have these additional 3 areas that we have to track. So what I always like to tell institutions is, before you publish your ASR, before you put those numbers in your ASR, and before you enter them into the Department of Ed's website, web portal, make sure that you can justify and that you know that there's a record that exists for every single statistic that you have in your ASR. Now, typically, campus police, university police, and public safety departments are able to produce records for the statistics that they collect. So, this is the typical kind of officer goes to an incident, completes a report, the report gets classified at some point. So in most cases, campus public safety departments don't have a problem producing those records, but it's the other records that create a challenge for institutions. So What about the sexual assault, your sexual assault numbers that come from your Title IX coordinator? Does your Title IX coordinator have good records for all of the reports that that person has responsibility for? What about reports that come from other CSAs, campus security authorities? How do you maintain those records? You know, most institutions, well, a lot of institutions are still in the mode of collecting data from CSAs, campus security authorities, once a year, and we always like to remind folks that CSA reporting is a real-time requirement, and so what infrastructure do you have so that you can document reports that come from your other CSAs on campus? So it's really important. And third, before I jump to the conclusion, there is the data from typically data that comes from student conduct. So how are you? Do you have records? Do you have files of documents that back up all of your disciplinary referrals for liquor law violations or drug law violations or weapons possession violations? Can you stand behind each number? So let's say, for example, you have 136 liquor law violations. 50 of those came from the university police. What about the remainder? Does the student conduct office or your judicial affairs office, do they have adequate records that that if you had to undergo a program review, backs up every statistic that you have in your ASR or that you reported to the Department of Education? And while I say that, let me just say that it's really important that what you put in your ASR matches what you have, what you enter into the Department of Ed's website. So not only is it the audit trail, but you also need to make sure that you're consistent with the numbers. And we see that a lot where, you know, that you publish the ASR in September, for example, you know, into the data until October 15th, somewhere between in that 45, you realize you made a mistake. So you put the right numbers into the web portal, but the ASR still has the wrong numbers, and you know you're obligated to go back and correct that. So it's all of this. This audit trail is really important, and it's something that you probably ought to be doing right now, given that it's, you know, September 3rd, and you know you got less than a month before you have to publish your ASR.
Right. And I think documentation is something that tends to come up pretty often, not even just in relation to the statistics, but a lot of times even in making the determination whether a timely warning goes out. Many times institutions will have so many different conversations to really determine what they're going to do for a particular scenario, and then later on, if the Department of Education does come in, they may not always recognize why they made the decision that they did in that moment. So even some other documentation that they may have in their files might be useful in that lens. Mike, is there a...
Can I follow up on that, Abby?
Oh, yes,
just
please.
Because this is one of my kind of pet peeves on the timely warnings. You know, obviously everyone knows what the criteria is for issuing a timely warning. So you have to have some way that you document your decision-making process, right? Because just as you said, Abby, if you're under program review and they go back 5 years, you're not going to remember why you did or didn't issue a timely warning for a particular incident. So it is critically important that you, we actually call we have a form, we call it the timely warning notice determination form. We advise institutions to complete that form because it forces you to go through a methodical process where you're actually determining either collaboratively with other folks who have, who have Clery Act responsibilities, but you're making that decision, and then you're documenting the decision. So if you're ever called to question as to why you did or didn't, at least you have at least you can justify. That doesn't necessarily mean that the Department of Education will agree or not agree or disagree with your decision, but at least you will have a record of why you made the decision that you made.
Right, and I think that that's a really great takeaway in general is how are we documenting our efforts. I think even with the VAWA amendments to Clery, a lot of you are doing some really great work in bringing together committees like we've been talking about. So how are you really documenting that this effort or reflecting that effort within your ASR is just something to think about. So for Mike, are there anything that you can share as to some of the common challenges that you're seeing at multiple institutions? You mentioned through your work at your own or with MHA.
Okay, great. Thank you, Abby. The first thing I want to draw people's attention to is this siloing issue that I talked about in my introductory comment. I was asked to work with the Washington, D.C. Military District Department of Defense police chiefs because there was a lot of pressure on the Department of Defense to also deal with sexual assault, concurrent with pressure within higher education from the government. And there are some similarities with respect to cohort, alcohol abuse, et cetera, et cetera. And as you were talking, it occurred to me, right on my own campus, we have an ROTC unit. Many of those ROTC units would discipline a student for sexual harassment, discipline a cadet for sexual harassment, and that may or may not come to the attention of the existing student disciplinary system. It may be something that the ROTC unit would take action unilaterally on. But that action would, in fact, satisfy the definition of a record generated for which a sanction may be imposed, which would require that you count that. So there's an example right there of where these silos can be difficult to crack, and you may not even think about them as you're constructing places where you want to collect data from. The other thing that I think is important is HR. Pam spoke about that earlier. Lots and lots of clients that we work with at NHA overlook the employee portion of the population. They do a great job, for example, with programming for students. They do a great job with awareness, but when we ask them, so tell me, how do your employees find out about domestic violence prevention? I'm not sure that going forward that question would be met with the same kind of robust, deeply embedded programming efforts that we see with respect to students. And as Pam pointed out earlier, that is in fact something that's required, been required in places in Clery and has been substantially expanded upon by the VAWA amendments.
Right. So I think just to kind of go back to some of the different themes that we've been hearing so far, I think some of the things that have really been stressed are having the right people at the table, whether it's for VAWA amendments or for Clery overall, taking a closer look at your own documentation, whether it's documents that are forward-facing that you're sharing with students and employees, or it's how you document your own decisions, and making sure that all of the people who play a role in Clery compliance make sure that they know their roles and their responsibilities, and that you're accurately reflecting what's happening, whether that's someone in HR that might play a role in training employees, whether that's other individuals on campus like CSAs who are responsible for reporting, or just anyone else that might need to pass along or share some of this information or document some of this information, as we've been talking about. So I think there's been a lot of really great kind of action items or things to think about on your own particular campus as we go through this. And we've had a lot of great questions coming in, which we're going to get to in just a moment. But I want to just try to wrap up with, we try to really stay solutions focused. So we know that certainly there are quite a bit of challenges to Clery compliance, but we've also seen many institutions have a lot of strengths. And it was interesting because we did a training a couple of months ago in which we had everyone go around and share their #1 challenge and their #1 strength, what their institution does really, really well. And what we found in that room is that people could really easily name their challenge, and they were really struggling to think about what they did well. But once they started talking about their strengths, they had a lot of really incredible programs and systems that unfortunately they were overlooking or not giving enough credit. So I'd like to just think a little bit about some steps that institutions can take right away to improve or enhance some of their already existing structures. So Stephen, what do you think is kind of the #1 thing that they should do?
Well, I don't think it would be any surprise for anyone who's ever heard me talk about this. I think that the #1 most important thing you can do to enhance your Clery compliance is to have a compliance committee. Pam said it, Mike said it, Abbi, you said it. Clery compliance is an institutional responsibility. And as long as we continue to treat it as if it's a public safety requirement, we're doomed to fail. And so when you form that committee, either at the request of a senior administrator or the general counsel, you have to get all the key players around the table to ensure that you are coordinating all of your efforts. Too many times We've seen, you know, an ASR where, you know, the campus public safety folks are in some cases, student affairs folks are doing a, you know, a really good job of putting all this stuff together. But when we go to different offices that have responsibility for some portion of Clery compliance, we find that they've never been consulted. So, you know, someone developed a policy or policy statement or procedures 4, 5, 6 years ago, but as that policy or procedure has changed and been updated, the ASR isn't updated. And so one of the important things is having this committee parsing out all of the policies and the policy statements and really ensuring that everybody understands what their role is. Especially now with the VAWA amendments, it's so important to make sure that everybody understands what the role is, and that the office that's charged primarily with producing the annual security report or the annual fire safety and security report knows who all those folks are and is actually working with them on an ongoing basis. Now, oftentimes when I say form a committee, people say, oh, we don't need another committee, we don't need another meeting. I respect that, and I know we probably don't need another meeting, but this is a committee you actually need, because if you don't approach this from a collaborative standpoint, you're doomed to fail or to miss something that's critical that will you know, get you in trouble at some point. So form that committee. I know you don't want another committee, you don't want to have to go to another meeting, but I'm telling you that the committee will make your life so much easier in the long run.
Yeah, and I think one thing that I'll kind of interject here and then see if there are other panelists that might want to add to that or speak to that is we've been hearing that a lot from our own collaborative members. We have a program in which teams of 5 to 7 individuals on a campus really embark in a multi-year process of building their own compliance and building their own programs. And one of the things that we have been hearing from members is a comment that someone shared at a recent training was they were saying that at their campus they saw a lot of this kind of rallying around Title IX, and they felt as though that they were the lone soldier, that lone individual who's been talking about Clery over and over, and they really weren't getting a response, or there weren't a lot of people who are kind of on board for it until the VAWA amendments. And this may be the experience of some of the rest of you as well, is we're seeing a lot of institutions really use the VAWA amendments as the opportunity to say, hey, you know, I've been saying that Clery is something that we all need to be working on for a while. Unfortunately, I haven't gotten much of a response, but here are these new amendments. What are we going to do about them? So even having these new things on your plate might also be a way to really start to get some of that buy-in and to bring some of those folks to the table. Pam, is that some of what you're seeing, or what are some of the things that you think that they should think about when bringing together a committee or bringing these folks to the table?
Yeah, so Abby, that's a great point, and I am seeing that a lot around the country with different institutions, that a lot of the people who work on Clery are saying, finally, people are listening to me. So from that perspective, it's a really good thing. And one thing that I would say is when pulling together these committees and figuring out what you're doing and giving yourself credit for what you're already doing and doing well, do be careful about not making assumptions. So I think, for example, institutions that really are doing quite well with Title IX might assume, okay, well, we have the sexual assault portion of this under control. But it's really important, kind of going back to my initial point, that VAWA and the VAWA amendments in Title IX are not the same thing. It's important to go back to what you're doing under Title IX and make sure that it also incorporates VAWA. So, for example, your educational programming might not have everything that VAWA requires. So it's important to go back to that and look. And if you put together a Clery committee, not only can you begin that assessment of what do we have in place, but you can begin to set priorities of what are we going to do first, because I'm assuming that our listeners out there struggle with the same thing that everybody on this call struggles with, and that's setting priorities, finding time, capacity, ability, etc. So you can set that priority, you can determine who's going to do what, and it kind of has some built-in accountability to it that you're going to have to come back to the committee, and it does help things move forward. Another thing that I would say, just on a specific thing where you don't want to commingle Title IX and VAWA, is on dating violence, domestic violence, and stalking. do be cautious not to assume that the policies you have in place already cover those. I think a lot of times institutions assume that those will be captured by their sexual misconduct or their sexual harassment policies. Sometimes those three things in particular do not always involve conduct of a sexual nature. And so they won't be captured by that policy. So again, just go back to those policies, don't make assumptions about them, and make sure that they actually capture all of the conduct that's covered by the VAWA amendments. And then the last thing that I would say is, as this committee is working, obviously they're going to be focusing on complying with the VAWA amendments. That's what they're there for. But there's strict compliance, and then there's actually doing it well. And on the one hand, they're the same thing, and on the other hand, they're not always the same thing. Anybody who works in this area knows that there is no standard case. There is no perfect case. There is no one particular way to handle these issues. And if you really only focus on strict compliance, there's a chance that you could handle a matter in a way that is strictly compliant, but doesn't actually handle the matter well for the individuals involved, or for your overall campus community, or for your campus's safety. So you want to, again, focus on compliance, but also always have the bigger picture in focus. And frankly, I think if you handle more focus on doing it well, you'll almost always achieve compliance, or at least good faith compliance.
I think that's a really great point, and I think that's something that we also see in relation to prevention programming. I know that we've had this discussion that so often institutions are really kind of in a rush to implement something that they feel will be in compliance, and they don't kind of more carefully look at their own campus culture and what's a good fit. And since I know we can't cover kind of all of these topics in one webinar, I just want to also mention here, since it's appropriate, that we have a number of other free webinars coming up throughout the month, some of which is really diving into that. So prevention programming, some things to consider with what you're putting together, and how do you really kind of decide what's best for your own institution while also considering that compliance framework. So those can all be found on our website as well. Anything else that you wanted to share before getting Mike's perspective?
No. Unless you had something in mind that I should.
No. I think that's
okay.
fine. I just wanted to make sure I didn't cut you off at all.
No, you didn't.
Mike, is there anything kind of that you would add? We had some really good kind of takeaways of going beyond the beyond checking a box and looking at doing things well versus just strict compliance and bringing together those committees. Is there anything else that you think institutions should consider before we move on to some of the questions that have been coming in?
Yeah, and I'll try to be brief in deference to people's time. So with respect to what we expect to see in the draft reg and what comes clear in the statute is the importance on programming and awareness, programming and prevention, bystander activation in the campus climate. And I talked earlier about silos. I kept hitting that. So I think on my own institution, what we've done is we've used a SurveyMonkey style form that we're asking all department heads to distribute to people within their departments who are doing programming. I think there's a lot of ways that data can be useful when it comes time for reaccreditation, when it comes time to comply with the Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act, but certainly when it comes time to document compliance with Title IX or with Clery, where there are specific programming benchmarks that are likely to come out of the regs. This is sort of a way to avoid that data being missed because of the silos that are inherent in our industry. The other thing that I want to point out is it's a good idea from soup to nuts to have the ASR reviewed by somebody who maybe has never looked at it before but has some passing familiarity with Clery. Somebody who can lay the ASR lay the ASR up against the checklist and make sure that it is getting all of those boxes checked. I'm not trying to run in direction contrary to Pam, but remember, compliance to some degree is making sure that the boxes are checked.
Well, and just to jump on, add to that, doing it well would be, again, making sure everything's in that ASR, but it's in a readable format, a usable format, the actual document that will serve your campus community. So it's that strict compliance and doing it well.
And if I could jump on just to dovetail on that, we call that ensuring that the document is accessible, and not accessible from an ADA perspective, but you need to do that as well. But to make sure that it's accessible, make sure that folks actually can read it. Remember, fundamentally, the Clery Act is a consumer rights bill, right? So how do we ensure that the people who are the intended audience, so prospective students,
I think we might be.
Is it useful to them?
I think that's a really excellent point. And I think, you know, accessibility and kind of going through even beyond, one of the things that we have seen is institutions who, with all of the different changes within the laws, as we know we've had quite a few changes over the past few years, we've had individuals who have kind of developed a template that they've been working off of, and then as things have changed and have been added, they just kind of plug things in at the end, as opposed to really thinking about, well, where does this really make sense within the flow of the information that we already have and kind of in that readable format. So I think that that's a really important thing to think about. So I think kind of incorporating all of that, it's a good point, Mike, from a compliance check kind of perspective, to have somebody who's going through to make sure that all the different elements are there. There could also be somebody who maybe has no background on Clery, a student or an employee, no background on Clery, who could even just go through for those readability elements to make sure that the things that you're communicating are really coming across. And I think that ties into some of what you were saying a little bit earlier, too, with making sure that if there are systems in place on your campus, if you have programs, if you have things that you're doing, that all of those are being reflected, because ultimately they should be institution-wide programs and policies, not just reflect what's within the campus safety and security department. Anything else that you wanted to add or expand on? I know that, Stephen, we were having some technical issues with you, so I may have cut off some of that tail end.
No, I'm fine. I think I said everything I needed to say.
Okay, great. Perfect. Well, then we'll move on to some of the questions. There have been quite a few that have been coming in as the webinar is occurring. So we'll start with one with the Clery Committees, because you've talked quite a bit about that. One of the questions is, how big are these committees and how often do they meet? So can someone give a sense of some of the things that you've seen with the Clery Committees?
This is Stephen. I'll take that. Typically, it's between 6 and 8 people. You don't want it too big, because then it becomes a little unwieldy. And what we've seen and what we tell folks is that in the initial stages of your committee, you're probably going to want to meet on a monthly basis. As you become more sophisticated and as the learning curve is less steep, then you probably only need to meet, every couple of months. But really, it is an opportunity when you kind of look at all the tasks that an institution needs to undertake in order to ensure a strong compliance program. The list is pretty daunting. You just look at the policies and the procedural aspects and the statistical gathering. It's enough to keep a committee busy at least for 18 months, just getting the hands wrapped around.
What about one of the things that's been coming up a lot in some of the questions from multiple people is, what about respondents and kind of what role do they play within the VAWA amendments? So when you're thinking about how you're communicating, what are some things that you should think about for not just complainants but respondents as well?
Do the questions give any additional thoughts about what they're thinking in terms of respondents, or?
I think some of it was right after you were talking about communicating in writing and having information in writing. So I think they just wanted to get a sense. It seemed as though people were looking for, since you have all these structures with VAWA, with providing rights and options in writing to victims, what are some things that you should consider from a respondent perspective?
So I think this might get to that point of strict compliance and doing it well. So to strictly comply with VAWA, and again, I know you're not supposed to commingle VAWA and Title IX, but a lot of these cases go with Title IX. There are now certain obligations that you have in terms of providing information to complainants. Handling this well on your campus, though, does mean treating your respondents fairly, and there are some requirements out there legally for institutions to do that. So I think it's important to be thoughtful about, number one, the compliance portion, giving the complainants the information that you're required to give them, and that there may be additional things you provide to complainants in order to handle matters well, but also then focusing, what is it that you want respondents to know? You would want them to know about your process. You would want them to know about resources within the community that are available to them. You may or may not be legally required to do that, but as this committee is looking at how these issues are handled on campus, not just from a strict compliance standpoint, it may well be that they say to handle this well, to serve our community well, we would also want to provide certain information to respondents. So I think just again, just because there's not a box you check that says you have to do this, doesn't mean it's not a smart thing to do.
We've also had a couple of other questions come in related to some of the more the statute itself. So one of the questions was, should policy prohibitions on domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking mirror state law prohibition of these offenses, or use paraphrased definitions in proposed Clery regs? The training must include state law definitions. So I wonder if any of you could really speak to the drafting of these policies related to VAWA.
I can take a crack at that, especially given that the regulation is not published yet. I think that an institution certainly is probably, we use consent as an example. An institution is probably going to draft a definition of consent, which is far more detailed than a state statutory definition. The state statutory definition being required to be an element of the education and awareness programming. There may also be issues of consent in Maryland, for example. There is no state statutory definition of consent. There's common law definition, and that's what we will refer to. However, I think that when it comes down to brass tacks, what you move forward on with respect to Title IX is going to be your institutional policy on consent, remembering that when you are counting Clery offenses, in order for there to be a sexual assault, one of the key elements is that it is non-consensual. So this is an example of where policy and practical application may require a rather sophisticated examination of a fact pattern. I don't know whether that answered the question or muddied the waters, and I'm sorry if it confused it.
Well, actually, Mike, you raised a good point. Kind of tying back to something I mentioned earlier about not making assumptions about things. I know when the issue of educational programming came up, I thought, oh, phew, you know, at least with regard to sexual assault, I know we have a lot of that training in place, and I know, you know, it's great. When I took that training and I compared it to the VAWA amendments to Clery, I realized, well, we used our own definition of consent, and we didn't have in there anywhere the Michigan definition of consent. And so we went and we popped that in and updated it. It didn't mean that we necessarily had to change our institutional definition. It simply meant we had to provide further education as to the state definition. So I think, again, you can still have your own policies and your own procedures. It's just making sure that in your educational effort, you're providing everything that you're now required to provide, in addition to what you might already provide to your community, because that's what you want to educate them on. And in terms of your policies and procedures, you know, the statute goes through and kind of clearly clicks through what you need to have in place. You might have a lot of that in place already, or there might be some things you need to add. I don't know if that answers the question as well. Or
no,
not?
I think that, at least from my lens, it does help to clarify a little bit that when you're looking at those prevention programs, they do have some information about including definitions from your own jurisdiction, and that's different from the definitions that you're going to see when counting Clery crimes, for example. So just recognizing that distinction. If you need help accessing the statute, I'm sure many of you have been working through it quite a bit. We also have it posted on our website in case you need it for reference. And some of what you were just sharing also goes into one of the other questions that we received, which is, what are other institutions doing to provide VAWA awareness campaigns to faculty? So I know you were talking a little bit about the programs that you have in place, especially regarding students, but can anyone speak to some of the examples that they've seen regarding VAWA programs or campaigns related to faculty?
I can. This is Steve, and I can jump in. So we're actually seeing things pretty much all over the map. We've seen institutions make annual training mandatory for all faculty members. I know that may not necessarily work at some institutions, but we have seen that at a number of institutions. We've seen institutions require online training, and that training is done in a learning management system so that there's a record of the training. And we've also seen institutions that are implementing their awareness programs through new employee orientation. And so, I mean, really when you think about it, there are a number of programs and educational endeavors that we require of employees. And I would say that, again, another reason your committee is so important, that you have all the right people around the table to say, okay, this is what we can do. You know, these are the union, you know, depending on what state, there might be union implications. But it's just important to have everybody around the table to talk about what the options are. But those are three of the options that we've seen thus far.
To add to that, you know, one thing I think Stephen will agree that we see a lot is an institution that might throw its hands up in the air and say, well, we just can't require faculty to do it. That will garner no respect, I think, from the Department of Education. And so I think whether you feel your faculty will actually participate or not, you should develop it and offer it. And granted, there will be a certain portion of your faculty who will never, ever, ever take the training, regardless of what you try to do. But rather than pander to them and say, therefore, it's not worthwhile even trying, do try. And you might be pleasantly surprised by how many of your faculty do participate simply because some feel it's the right thing or because their dean or department chair asks them to.
Thank you. Some of these other questions are kind of all over the map, so we're going to kind of jump to a different topic really briefly. But one of the questions that they had related to some of what Stephen was sharing in kind of keeping an audit trail is, how long should they retain records?
Well, I can answer that, or Mike can answer it, but the bottom line is the regulations require us to maintain the records for a minimum of 3 years, 3 years after the last date that it's published. And I'm not a mathematician, and I don't play one on television, and I always get this messed up whenever I do it. But so if you just work backwards,
so that would be 7.
Yeah, it's basically it's basically almost 7 years that you need to maintain from the time that an incident was reported to the time that you follow whatever your destruction policy calls for. Now, remember, there may be state statutes that have additional requirements. So, that, you know, for federal law, it's 7 years total, almost 7 years. But you may have state statutes or other laws that also require retention beyond that point.
And there is some language in the Handbook for Campus Safety and Security Reporting regarding the ASR that speaks to that 7-year guideline. So if you need any assistance in finding that or locating that, we're happy to get that for you. Amy just put the handbook link within the within the chat, so that you're able to access that. And since we're right at the end, we'll just go with one more There was one person who asked for institutions that are in states without legal definition of consent, are there any good examples that you could suggest?
I know there's a lot of stuff coming out of California right now, even if you don't necessarily agree, but you know, California, well, it hasn't been signed by the governor yet, but they've come up with a mandatory definition of consent. You could start there. Sorry, Mike, I know you were going to say something as well.
Well, I just wanted to be clear on the point that I made earlier. The statute requires in your programming that you say what the local definition of is. That can be case law, that can be statutory, but somewhere if somebody's charged with a crime of sexual violence, as a rule, consent is an element of that crime. So in order for somebody to be found guilty, for example, of rape, somebody somewhere in a courtroom has addressed the issue of consent. Your policy does not need to be, in fact, is probably not going to be even close to what the state definition, whether it be common law or statutory, what the state definition of consent is. Most colleges and universities are going to have a very long and carefully constructed definition of consent. And I think that with respect to finding the state definition, if you're not sure, local prosecutor may be able to help you, or institution counsel may be able to help you with that. The institution's definition of consent could be in the employee handbook or in the student handbook.
And if you're looking for, whether it's for policy development or looking for your state and local definition, I'd also encourage you to reach out to local rape crisis centers or your state organization for that, because oftentimes they would have feedback in both realms, whether it's related to the law itself or for what they're seeing in policies. The California Coalition Against Sexual Assault has also done quite a bit of work around this as well, so they're a great resource. Well, thank you so much. We are at the end of the webinar, and we want to respect your time and the time of our panelists. However, you'll notice that Amy put in the chat section that we do have a survey. We would love to get your feedback on the webinar today to see if there are any other areas that you'd like to see more of, additional content that you'd like to see. Thank you to all of our panelists, to Pamela, to Mike, and to Stephen. We really appreciate you taking the time. If you have any follow-up or any additional questions that you need, you'll see our email on the screen in front of you, and as Amy mentioned, we'll also make that recording available within 48 hours of this webinar, so you will have all the opportunities to be able to contact our organization, as well as our phone number is on the screen. So thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. We really appreciate it, and have a great day.
Bye.